Hi, this is Graham, and this is our 7th week in which we're going to be exploring project management. Around 50% of most managers' time is reckoned to be devoted to projects of various kinds. The CIPD chapter, which is the last in the book, rather oddly mixes project management with career management, talent management, and self-responsibility. I suspect it's really because it's the last chapter and they're trying to provide a bit of a wrap-up rather than providing a summary chapter. Let's focus on project management for the moment because there's plenty of material to get our teeth into there. Apparently, a project is a unique venture with a beginning and an end, conducted by people to meet established goals within parameters of cost, schedule, and quality. We might disagree with quite a lot of this. Philosophically, of course, there's never such a thing as a repetitive process. Clearly, there are plenty of projects, though, that do happen more than once. That is, after all, one of the benefits of project management, because it allows us to systematize what we're doing and therefore be in a better position to do the next project. It also enables us to learn from previous ones before we embark on a new one. You've only got to ask a house builder like Barratt Homes and they'll tell you that most of their projects are repetitive. They have a system in place, they flex the goals, the milestones and so on, but fundamentally they are following the same process. I also would question whether all projects serve to meet established goals. The question really is who defines those goals? Is everyone that's responsible for their delivery also party to the goals? Do they even understand what they are? And in many cases, I would argue that the failure of a project is because some key stakeholders weren't sufficiently aware of or engaged with the goal-setting process. And certainly there are a lot of projects that don't have all of the parameters of cost, schedule and quality predefined. It's a dream of builders. That's why they make their money. So to suggest that all projects and the definition of a project revolves around having predefined cost, schedule and quality goals seems a little bit silly to me. Common sense says that the vast majority of projects are never actually managed. They simply depend upon the experience of the implementer and their ability to work intuitively. That's the basis of an apprenticeship system originally. Despite this, there are some authorities who would have you believe that all projects must follow their particular pet protocol. I'd urge you to be very cautious about those, because usually somebody is either naive or has a vested interest. Equally, an awful lot of very large-scale projects, even programs, which tends to be the term that's used for multiple projects, all under one umbrella, they very often will go over budget, over time, or they'll fail to meet any objectives, even though there may have been a massive investment in project management up front. So project management is a valuable tool, it's a valuable set of skills, it's important that we understand what it's all about, and perhaps a little bit about the origin of it and what it's trying to achieve, but we need to be flexible, we need to be very focused on what we're trying to achieve, rather than allowing ourselves to get embroiled in the process. Project management itself primarily began in civil engineering, and it only actually emerged as a recognised term in the 1950s. So were the projects, the massive construction projects by the Egyptians, by Christopher Wren, by Robert Hooke, by Van Brugh, by Capability Brown, were they all entirely unmanaged? No, of course not. They simply used different approaches that worked for them. Project management is something that has been around ever since the Egyptians or before. The Wikipedia article about project management is fairly accurate and it's fairly comprehensive, but it doesn't mention a few key models between the work of Gantt and Fayol, who introduced a mathematical approach, if you like, to project management, right the way through to, and whose work led to the emergence of project management in the 1950s, and then the development of the protocols, first of all Prince, then Prince 2, with the intermediary steps like LBMS and SSADM. We'll pick up on those in a moment. I would argue that the links that they make in the chapter between scientific management and project management through Gantt and Fayol are extremely tenuous. Scientific management was about analysing individual workers' activities in minute detail and then focusing them on highly repetitive tasks to ensure consistency and efficiency. It was popularised by Taylor and became known as Taylorism. As we know from Dan Pink's work published in 2010, this was destined to fail from the beginning. People do not like having their work organised in that way, and they react emotionally to having it done that way. Taylorism led to riots. It was banned by both French and US legislation. It nearly brought about the collapse of the French government because their armories were being run or attempted to be run by Taylorism. And the US car industry ground to almost a halt because of Taylorism. It had to be banned. So be very cautious about anybody who tells you that Taylorism and work method studies and things of that kind, time and motion studies, are effective. Whoa, they are not. They lead to an enormous human disruption. Project management provides a tool for agencies, and in particular government agencies, to monitor major programs of work by private contractors. Project management methods tend to be highly systematized, they tend to be very bureaucratic, and in the UK they tend to be based on Prince2. Prince2, Prince, stands for Projects in Controlled Environments, and effectively Prince2 divides projects into controllable stages. It was initially developed by a UK government department responsible for external contracting in the telecoms sector. It's now owned by an organisation called Axelos, and that is a joint venture between Capita, the consultancy company, who own 51% of the shares, and the Cabinet Office, who own 49%. Little surprise that any project that the Cabinet Office is responsible for sponsoring demands that the work is managed according to Prince2 methodology. But it gets a bit more complicated. SSADM, which stands for Structured Systems Analysis and Design Method, is also a structured approach. Initially it was to the analysis and design of systems, but then it evolved into a full-blown project management tool. SSADM was published or produced by the Central Computer and Telecoms Agency, which is part of the Office of Government Commerce and in turn is funded by the UK Treasury. So any Treasury-backed projects almost always will insist upon SSADM being used as the project management methodology. You can see how it becomes, project management becomes a political tool between departments within a government. SSADM is one of several structured analysis and development methods. There are lots of others, and almost all of them are proprietary in some form or another. You'll come across terms by models by Checkland, Constantine, Jordan, particularly Jordan, Jackson and DeMarco. They're exactly the same. They are a commercialized product. SSADM is probably the most comprehensive document-led approach to system design. It revolves around having documentation. But it is known also as a waterfall method because it cascades through the organization or through the project, but it doesn't really allow for steps to be iterated. You can't push water back up a hill, so it is a downward continuous process. This obviously has some problems associated with it, because if you can't iteratively improve along the way, if you go wrong early in the project, the chances are your outcomes are not going to meet what you were expecting to achieve. This contrasts enormously with what we would call contemporary agile methods of project management, and I'll pick up on those in a moment. Waterfall methods are the originals. They started with Bennington in 1956. They were enhanced by Royce in 1970. They were described specifically as Waterfall Methods of Project Management by Bell and Thayer in 1976, and they were finally consolidated under a US Department of Defense, spot the government intervention here, US Department of Defense standard in 1985. It's known as DoD STD 2167A. Initially, these kinds of waterfall approaches were focused on achieving project milestones. However, from around about 1994 onwards, the Department of Defense moved away from waterfall methods. They moved to ones that were, like SSADM, documentation driven. But in their case, they were based around what they called data item descriptions, or DIDs. This approach is the one that has become encapsulated in the civilian approach to project management of major projects, and it's what's published as the project management body of knowledge. It all coincided with an attempt to professionalize project management. You remember from when we were working on the professionalization of human resources, I was talking about the importance of having a body of knowledge for a profession. Well, this is what they did too. So lots of tools, lots of techniques, lots of approaches. You need to be familiar with the ones that you are being told must be used, and you need to be aware of some of their failings and shortcomings. The CIPD's model that they refer to has 4 phases: conception, development, realization, and termination. Structured modified waterfall approaches tend to have around about 9 stages in them. The formal methods that have all been developed by government agencies, whether in the UK or the US, are also ones that tend to have that kind of number of stages. More than 10 is unusual, but bear in mind that there will be iterations within those very often, and the iterations can massively increase the number of stages involved in the project plan. That really highlights something else. All project plans involve some kind of drilling down, of having levels within levels, so that a project team overall may be dealing at the strategic level. They may have 9 stages. Within one of those stages there might be a number of other smaller teams, and so you get this hierarchy created. Again, we've talked about the problems of hierarchy, and in particular in relation to communications. That's why many private sector projects nowadays use a variant of agile project management, which works around having fast, and they're typically 2 to 3 week project development cycles in between formal communication activities, but formal with a lowercase f, because these are often simply get-togethers of those with a vested interest in a particular stage or a particular activity. So informal communication activities perhaps is a better way of putting it, though agile revolves around ongoing communication, and that's the fundamental difference between it and any of the other project management tools. So why do projects fail? You can do Google searches and they'll come up with dozens and dozens of different reasons why projects fail. This is just my pot list, if you like. It's my brain dump of some of the projects that I've been involved in where I've seen the project simply not produce what it was expected to. Common amongst them, different expectations among the stakeholders, where perhaps the project team have one set of expectations, the board of directors a different set of expectations, and so on. A lack of acceptance of the likely impact. Frequently I've come across boards of directors who have embarked upon a project thinking it was something simple to do with a new IT system, and not realizing that it might well unfold into enormous organizational change. Third one that I would identify is where the context of the organization's strategy changes, and it moves away from, diverges from, the project management or the project itself. So, for example, A lot of banks invested a fortune in revising their banking systems to online technologies. They completely missed the point that mobile technologies were going to step over those ones. The organisation strategy, the people who were running the business, who were more in touch with customers, realised that mobile solutions, apps, were much more important. But by then the project tools had already been put into place to deliver big system changes around online banking. The banks took a long time to catch up, probably exacerbated because of the 2008 collapse. Fourth one in here is the irrelevance of a project to the organisation's actual survival. I've spoken in the past about the importance of understanding what your organisation does to survive. What is it that its real business is? In a lot of cases, that's actually real estate management. So the survival of an organisation can depend upon the effective use of the land that it owns. If that's the case, then having a project which is going to involve vast amounts of money in relocating your library archives to Swindon rather than having them in Oxford might actually be a little bit superfluous. And often projects will have the plug pulled on them simply because they have moved far too far away from things that will lead to the organisation's survival. Fifth one, we've all come across it, where an organisation's culture is based around blame, and that leads to cover-ups, where the project team can't admit to the fact that something is going wrong, and therefore, I think it's often called green-siding. They will tend to make it look as though the project is okay, but in their heart of hearts they know that it's gone way off track. Honesty is very often a much better policy in the long term. But of course that all revolves around the culture, and that's why agile technologies, agile approaches are expected to be better, because they revolve around the right kind of culture to encourage openness about project problems. Next one I would say is overly optimistic expectations. This is where somebody says, oh, if we introduce this particular project, then it will address all of our issues. It's the panacea to all ills. The police, fire and rescue and ambulance service implemented a new telecoms system for alerting their first responders to problems, to emergencies. The technology that they bought into, the project for its implementation and so on, all went ahead. It was when it was delivered that it was realised that actually it wasn't capable of doing the job that it was meant to do. So there had been an overly optimistic expectation of what it could achieve, consequently too little money was thrown at it, and therefore the project's failed. It has to be replaced. Another burden on the resources. Next one, new technologies and unexpected competition. I've mentioned the mobile issue in terms of new technologies, but what often can happen, particularly in a commercial project, is that you think you've come up with the next best thing to sliced bread. What you don't realise is that while you are developing that and taking it to market, one of your competitors, who you may not have even known were a competitor, they may not have even existed because they could be a startup, they have come up with something which just totally radically alters the way that we tackle these things. Sometimes it can be at very small scale level, and that's particularly the case with startups, because they may only be a one product business to begin with. They may have had one good idea, but if they can take over a whole market for that particular sector, then they can expand into other more traditional spaces. Loads of examples. You've only got to look out on the more innovative product sites, Monarchy and things like that, and you'll find all sorts of examples. I came across one recently, which is an accessory fan attached to the side of a laptop. Sounds daft, but it's thermally operated. It is so much more effective than the traditional approach to trying to cool down computers and laptops, and it increases the processing speed. It's another way of extending the life of a laptop. It's a simple technology, but it came out almost at exactly the same time as somebody else was putting forward gel technologies that they had been developing for a long time, had thought they would be the panacea because they were based on a new product, a new material, a hypercooling material, liquid or gel. But they were wrong. The fans work. They simply attach. They were quicker to bring to market and they're more effective. So new technologies, old technologies, not knowing what the competitor's doing can lead to a failure of a product or a project for that matter. There's probably all sorts of other reasons, and as I said, do a Google search, you'll come across quite a few, but also think about some of the projects you've encountered and what led to their success or failure. Most of the times, projects fail. Let's be honest about it. And so, something to reflect on. Most managers, let alone HR ones, are dealing with projects 50% of the time. Most projects fail. Now bear that in mind when you attach your career to the outcomes from a project. It's the easiest way to commit career suicide. So often somebody gets moved into a project, their original role gets filled by someone coming up the system, excuse me, and as a result, when the project fails, there's nowhere for them to come. Anyway, they have been labelled as a failure, and so they have no option but to move on and move out. And of course, their credibility has been shot as well because they've been associated with something that didn't work. So before you take on being involved in a project, you need to be pretty clued up about its potential success. Most projects involve a substantial amount of organisation development. They can come in two ways. Projects that are deliberately established to bring about changes in the way that the organisation behaves, in which case clearly there's an organisation development involvement. But most other projects will have this as a knock-on effect. Most other projects, even if they are ones that are purely technical, will actually bring about changes in the behaviour of people at work and depend upon attitude changes, because often they are there to try and replace a negative culture or need a positive one to replace the negative one. They also therefore are OD projects. As I've said, most projects fail, and most projects fail because of ineffective communication. At the root of them, ineffective communication is the issue. Therefore, we as HR professionals have to engage with them. There is no avoiding it. We have got to be involved. That said, as I've pointed out, they can also be the easiest form of career suicide. So, to be treated with respect. Okay, lots of stuff to play around with there about project management.